All right, so today we are going to take a look at creating estimates using percents. What the goal of today is basically how we estimate the percent of a number using a couple of different methods. Make sure you date today's work and then follow along recording your work, and make sure you're putting this in your binder when you're done. So the first method that we're going to talk about for estimating is called the fraction method. In the fraction method, what you're going to do is you're going to round to the nearest benchmark fraction, and use it to estimate. As we've talked about in class, there are certain fractions and percentages and decimals that you should just kind of know. For example, we should know that 25% is 1/4, 50% is 1/2, 75% is 3/4. It's also good to know that 33% is 1/3, and 66% is about 2/3. And then the other thing, if you don't have one of these benchmark fractions, is kind of thinking just the closest 10%. So for example, 20% would be 2/10 or 1/5. So when we're doing this, what we're going to look at is, say you had to find 47% of 120. Since we're just trying to find an estimate, what we're going to do is we're going to round 47% to something that's close. So in this case, I'm going to round it to 50%. And 50% is the same thing as finding 1/2. So now I'm going to find half of 120. Well, half of 120 is 60. So now I know that 40% of 120 is around 60. So why don't you try this one on your own? So what if you wanted to find 67% of 12? Right? So we want to think kind of in terms of compatible numbers. So here, I might make 67 into 66%, because I know that 66% would be the same as finding 2/3 of 12. And what I mean by compatible numbers is looking really at that denominator of our fraction to see if our whole number is divisible by it. If not, we can also kind of change our whole number to make it easier to work with as well. In this case it is. So I'm going to take 12 and divide it into 3 pieces. So with visually, if you think about those bar models, okay, split into 3 pieces, each piece has a value of 4. And so now, because I need 2 of those pieces, 2 times 4 is 8. So 67% of 12 is about 8. This strategy works really well. I like using it. However, I know a lot of people also like using what's called the 10% method. And a lot of people use this for tipping in particular. In the 10% method, what we're going to do is you're going to start by finding 10% of the number, and then multiply for each group of 10%. So let's look at an example of what this would be like. So say, for example, I went to a restaurant, and a lot of times it's typical to tip around 20% of your bill. So I want to know what's 20% of $24.75, because say that was what my total was. So here, because I want to make it a little bit simpler and I'm estimating, I'm going to do 20% of $25, because 25 is pretty close to 24. So first I'm going to find 10% of 25, which is really like dividing by 10. So I'm going to take my decimal point, I'm going to move it back one spot. So 10% of 25 is equal to 2 5/10. But because I wanted 20% and not 10%, I'm going to take that 2 5/10 and double it or multiply it by 2. So in this case, my tip would be about $5. Right? So if we try another one, you can pause the video and try this one on your own. Say we wanted to know 30% of 135. So first I'm going to take 135. I could round it to 140 or 130 if I wanted to, but this one's not too bad to work with. I'm going to divide it by 10 to find that 10%, or move my decimal point back one spot, and it becomes 13 5/10. Since I need 30%, I'm going to take 3 times the 13 5/10, and we end up with 40 5/10 as our answer. So either method is totally fine to work. Kind of depends on the situation. The 10% method is really nice because all it is kind of moving those decimal points around. But the fraction method works really well too, especially if you have weird numbers that you're working with.